Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Job, the Sefer Iyov. We are about to study today chapter 31. Because this is a very long chapter, a total of, 40 verses, I'm going to split it in half, and this will be 31a. In the last two chapters, the last several chapters, we have been reading Iyov's last monologue in response to his friends. He's given up on his friends, so this is not really directly addressing them specifically, but just his final response to them, kind of doubling down on the idea that Iyov has been expressing, that I am not guilty, I am not the reason, I don't deserve this punishment, and turning to God, asking God, why then am I suffering despite my innocence? And asking God, as we saw several chapters ago, for wisdom, for knowledge, understanding, to understand what, why, where, what's the purpose, what's the point. And hoping that once he can at least achieve wisdom, he can bear the suffering, he can bear his fate. Now, in the last two chapters, in 29 and 30, in 29, Iyov kind of reminisced about the good old days, when everything seemed to make sense. I was good, I was honest, I was just, I was kind, and therefore I was respected, I was wealthy, I was healthy, my children, my family were happy, etc. But then, despite being good, and in chapter 30, he went and showed how he lost all of his honor, lost all of his respect, lost respect from others, lost all of his wealth, lost his health, lost his family. And now it doesn't make sense anymore. Now he's asking God for some semblance of understanding. So with that, we begin 31, where he continues to talk about, the suffering that he's in, but insists that he's innocent, because one might then respond and say, well, maybe you're not so innocent. So this chapter is Iyov making a series of oaths, swearing that he is innocent and he was a good person. So much so that as we read verse 1, even things which aren't necessarily crimes in and of themselves, but he even avoided things which can lead in a bad direction. So he begins with the classic example of that, where he says, Birit korati le'enoi, I made a covenant with my eyes, umo'et bonein al betzula, that I shouldn't even think about literally a betula is a virgin or a young woman. In other words, I was careful not to allow my thoughts to go places which can lead in wrong directions. Obviously, being et bonein, thinking about the beauty of a young woman, is not in it of itself a terrible thing at all. However, what Iyov is pointing out here is that I was so careful to behave that I was even careful not to go down that road, which can lead to what, about a couple verses from now, he's going to say real crimes that can result from someone who allows himself to go down that path. But despite this, he says in verse 2, Umeh chelek Eloah mimo'al. So what portion did I receive from God above? V'nachlat Shaddai mimormim. What was my inheritance from Shaddai, from God, from up there in the heavens? In other words, despite my being careful to remain on the proper path, what did I get? We know what I got, unfortunately, this terrible suffering. Halo aid la'avol, right? As Rashi points out, behold, aid, suffering, tragedies are appropriate for someone who is an avol, who is a wrongdoer, who is an evil person. V'necher lefoale aven, and bad things, necher, things that estrange, that happens to someone who is estranged from God, bad things, that would be appropriate lepoale aven, to those who do mischief, who do bad things. Halahu yired rachai. And behold, we know that God sees what I do. He sees my path in life. He's able to count every step I take. God knows everything that I'm doing. He knows my path, right? But nonetheless, what was my chelek? What was my portion? Suffering. Even though I could understand that it would go to someone who is evil, but me? God sees me, God knows me, but nonetheless, this is my portion. If we just a second back in verse 2, that phrase, chelek elokam ima'al, is something that turns up a lot completely out of context in the Kabbalistic literature, much later on in history, as referring to a person's soul as a portion of God from above. But it's completely out of context, because what it means here is, and what is then my portion that God has given me from above? Suffering. Just wanted to point that out. So here Eov is not, as his friends had accused him, he's not blaspheming God at all. He says, the reason for my pain and the my lack of understanding is that I know that God sees everything that I do. I know that he's there. He knows my way. Im holachti im shav, right? And this language, this is verse 5, is a language of swearing, right? And he's swearing that I have never went on a false path. I have never went with the path of dishonesty, right? Or it could mean, I've never went on the path together with dishonest people. Vatachash al mirma ragli, right? And my feet have never ran towards mirma, is like fooling others, to deceive others. I've never went down that path. Yishgaleni v'mod tzedek. He challenges God and says, "Let God measure out, balance me out on the scales of righteousness." V'yeda Eloah tumasi, and God will know my tumasi. Here is with taf mem, is my purity, my integrity, my honesty. And this was the term, the same root that God used when he himself described Eov as tam, as being perfect with him. And so Eov knows that God knows that he was perfect with God. Imtite ashuri mini hadarach. Right? Again, this im here is also a language of an oath, right? I swear that my feet have never strayed from this path. V'achar einai holach libi. And I swear that my heart has never went after my eyes, because remember, he started this by saying, my eyes will gaze upon a young girl and make me think things, and then libi, my heart, will then go and chase after those things. And we'll see again in future verses what might be the end result of that. But God knows that I never went, I did not allow my heart to go after my eyes. Uvichapai dovak mu'um. And on my hands, right, a nothing stained, in other words, nothing stolen, nothing dishonest was within my hands. But had I done such things, had I been guilty of those things, Ezra avi acher yochel, then I would be worthy of being punished. So may the things that I plant be eaten by others, v'tzetzoi yisharashu, and may my descendants be uprooted. Or that tzetzoi could mean, usually here most commentaries understand this to mean my children, those that come from me, but some translate it as tzetzoi, those things that I produce, referring back to the Ezra, the things that he plants. But zera also could mean children. But either way, that's how I translated that term. The point being that may I be punished if I truly did those things, if I did go down the path of deceit and dishonesty, if I did allow my heart to follow after my eyes and go into the path which I'm about to read in the next verse, then I would deserve punishment. Verse 9, Im niftali bi alisha, if my heart, in other words, from my eyes to my heart, and now if my heart was then seduced by a woman, by an actual woman. In other words, I start with the gazing, then my heart, and then I allow myself to be seduced, v'al pesach re'i oravti, and then in the end, waiting on the door of my friend, of someone else, and waiting and crouching for him to leave so that I can be secluded with his wife and commit the sin of adultery, because that's ultimately where such things can lead. So he's saying, I never went down that path. But if I did, verse 10, then titchan li acher ishti, then may my wife be, and this is kind of a very vulgar term, be ground, right, by another. And may others bend over her. This is a very vivid description of a sexual act, right? So in other words, if I actually did anything like that, then I would deserve to suffer by having my wife be visited by another. And why is such a path terrible? Because we know ki hi zima. This is a disgusting sin, right? This is something that leads to zima, to an environment of debauchery. V'hu avon plilim. It is a sin for which real punishment would be deserved. Avon plilim in modern Hebrew, I think, means a criminal offense. I think as opposed to a misdemeanor. I don't know. I have to ask someone who's an expert in modern Hebrew legal terms. But regardless, the point being that once it leads to adultery with others, and then others with my wife, eventually it leads to a situation where violence occurs and criminal offenses take place. That's why it's so important for me to take the first step that I started with in verse 1. Eov is saying, right, not to go down in that direction at all. Ki eish hi ad avadon tochel, because this kind of behavior is like a fire that burns and brings everything around it to avadon. Avadon is a term that refers to hell or destruction, right? To absolute loss of everything. Once that is breached, once the lines that are drawn to protect us from sinking into the depth of depravity are breached, it's a fire that consumes the society around it. Uv'chol tvuasi tisharesh. And then in all of my the things that I produce, it will uproot them. It will pull them out. This is, in other words, it just ruins everything. It tears everything apart. And anyone that knows anything about who's experienced, infidelity and these kinds of things knows that these problems, they spill over into everything and just ruin everything. It ruins trust. It just ruins everything around them. And that's what he's saying. Why it is such a sin, and it often leads to violence between people. And then he goes on, after describing how innocent he was in that arena of life. Then he makes another shvuah, he makes another oath. Im emas mishpat avdi va'amosi. I have never pushed away, or I have never felt it beneath me. Emas literally means to make something disgusting, but here in this context it means like, I'm a big important guy, so I don't need to pay attention to these little things. When my servant or my maidservant, in other words, the people that are on the lowest rungs of society, when they came to me for justice, I didn't treat it like it didn't mean anything. Birivami madi, when they had a complaint against me, I didn't say, well, I'm the big guy, so I don't need to even care about their complaints. If they came to me and criticized me, I listened and I took them seriously, right? And Eov is saying this because he's looking at himself as a servant in relation to God. And therefore in verse 14 he says, so what should I do when God gets up? And when he pays attention to me and looks over my account, what am I going to answer him? In other words, I can't even talk to God. I'm trying, I'm asking, and I'm getting no answers, right? But when people came to me, when my servant came to me, I paid attention, I listened. And why did I listen? Because it's the right thing to do. Verse 15, halo beveten oseni asahu. Because in the same womb, the same human body that I was created in, so too the servant was created in. Vayichunenu borechem echad. We were all prepared and set up in the same womb, right? In other words, we're all human beings, And I treated them like a human being, despite their status in the society that he lived in. And obviously, in the Eov's time, that's not how most people treated slaves and servants. But Eov is coming to say to God, I treated them with respect. Im emname chefetz dalim. Did I withhold the desires of those that were impoverished? If someone who was impoverished and came to me with a need, I filled it. Ve'enei almana achaleh. Did I allow the eyes of a widow to cry and pine with need and want? V'ochal piti levadi. Did I eat my bread alone? He says in verse 17. V'lo achal yasom mimena, and not allow the orphan to share it with me, to eat from the bread. Ki min neurai gedileni cha'av. No, I swear that what I did was from the time I was a child. In other words, and you can't even say maybe there was a time in my life that I wasn't good. No, from my childhood, Eov said, I was always this way. I raised him, right? I raised the orphan with me like I was a father, right? I raised him in the same way I would have raised my own children. Umi beten imi anchena, right? And I led him, right? I led her in this case, meaning this is referencing, he's flipping back and forth from the orphan to the widow, right? I led her from the time I was a child, from the time I was born. I was helping the widow, I was helping the poor, I was helping the orphan. Verse 19, Imeret oved mebli levush. Have I ever seen someone wandering without any clothing, right? Someone poor and impoverished, just wandering lost without clothing, ve'en ksus le'evyon, and see an impoverished person with no clothing. Imlo berchuni chalatzov. Has his loins not blessed me? Umigez kivasayis chamam, because I gave him from the shearings of my sheep in order so that he should have clothing and stay warm, right? No, just the opposite. Literally his loins, meaning his nakedness, blessed me because I clothed him. I never walked by a person like that and didn't help him. Im hanifosi al yasom yadi. Have I ever raised my hand against an orphan? Ki ereb b'sharez rasi, because I saw in the gate. The gate is the place where the important people, where the judges and the officials of the city, right, would sit, right? Because I knew that in the gate, nobody would hold me responsible if I didn't help out a poor person. I was on the top of the society. I could have gotten away with anything. But despite knowing that those people in the gate, those people that mete out justice, would always be on my side against the poor, I still never raised my hand against the orphan. But if I did do that, if I did take advantage of my position and use it to harm others, then kiseifi mishichmati pol, this is verse 22, may my arm fall from its socket, may my arm fall from my shoulder, v'ezro'i mikonati shaver, and may my forearm break off at the joint, right? So this is the end of verse 22, and this is where I'm going to stop for the first half of the chapter. In other words, if I really did treat people that way, then I would deserve the punishment that I'm getting. But I didn't. I was innocent. So this will conclude the first half of chapter 31. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to finishing this chapter in the next podcast. Have a wonderful day.